In war, there are moments that do more than make headlines. They change the psychological balance of the entire conflict. This may be one of those moments. Iran has now claimed that its forces targeted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a statement that, if true, would mark a dramatic escalation in a war already moving into dangerous territory. And even if the full details remain unconfirmed, the message behind the claim is already impossible to ignore. Because this is no longer just about missiles crossing the sky or another exchange of threats between two enemies. This is about what happens when one side wants the world to believe that even the top political leadership of its rival is no longer beyond reach. That changes the tone immediately. It changes how the public reacts, how allies calculate risk, and how military planners prepare for what may come next. If a sitting prime minister can be directly threatened, then the conflict is no longer operating inside the same boundaries as before. And that is why this story matters far beyond one statement from Tehran. The moment a war starts touching the highest level of state leadership, every silence becomes louder, every delay becomes more suspicious, and every response carries greater weight. What makes this even more explosive is that the uncertainty itself becomes part of the story. Iran has made the claim, Israel has faced growing questions, and the longer confusion lingers, the more dangerous the entire situation becomes. Because in modern conflict, perception is not secondary to the battlefield. Perception is part of the battlefield. And right now, that battlefield may be expanding faster than anyone is willing to admit. The first thing that matters in a story like this is separating confirmed fact from wartime narrative. That line is never easy to hold when missiles are flying and governments are controlling information, but it is exactly where this story begins. What we know is that Iran publicly claimed it targeted Benjamin Netanyahu's office. That claim alone was enough to send shockwaves through the region, because it suggested that Tehran was no longer speaking only in terms of retaliation, but in terms of direct pressure on Israel's highest political leadership. We also know that once a claim like this enters the public arena, it immediately changes the atmosphere around the conflict. Analysts begin questioning what was hit, officials begin reviewing what they can say, and the public begins focusing on the one issue that matters most in that moment. Was the target really reached? But beyond that point, uncertainty starts taking over. And uncertainty in wartime is never passive, it becomes a force of its own. Because when the facts are incomplete, all sides try to shape the gap. One side wants the world to believe it has reach. The other side wants to avoid giving that claim legitimacy before it is fully addressed. And in the space between those two goals, the fog thickens. That is why this is not only a military story, but also an information war. A strike can damage a building, but a claim like this can damage confidence, raise fear, and push rivals toward decisions before the truth is fully clear. So at this stage, the real issue is not just whether Iran made the claim, it is what that claim is now doing to the conflict. It is forcing Israel to confront a dangerous narrative. It is forcing allies to consider whether escalation has entered a more serious phase. And it is forcing the rest of the world to watch this confrontation through a new lens, one in which the battlefield may be reaching closer to the center of political power than ever before.
The most dangerous point in a conflict is often not the strike itself, but the moment one side decides it must restore deterrence at any cost. That is where this situation may now be heading. If Iran truly intended to send a message with this strike, then the target tells us everything. This was not just about causing damage, it was about forcing Israel, the United States, and the wider region to confront a new level of risk. Because once the name of a sitting prime minister enters the strike narrative, the conflict changes shape immediately. A military base is one kind of target. A weapons depot is another. But when the office or location tied to a national leader becomes part of the story, the meaning becomes far more political, far more psychological, and far more dangerous. That is because wars are not fought only through destruction. They are fought through pressure, signaling, fear, and the ability to make the other side feel exposed at the highest level. And that may be exactly what Iran wants here. Tehran does not necessarily need the world to know every detail with perfect certainty in the first hours. It only needs enough uncertainty to spread, enough to make Israel look vulnerable, enough to push Israeli officials into defensive messaging, enough to make allies wonder whether this confrontation is moving beyond controlled retaliation and into something much harder to contain. That is why the symbolic value of this claim may be even greater than the physical outcome. If Iran can convince the region that no political office is fully beyond reach, then it has already shifted the psychological balance of the conflict. It has already introduced doubt into the image of control that Israel depends on, especially during wartime. And once doubt enters that image, every delay, every silence, and every unclear response starts carrying much more weight. This is how modern escalation works. The missile is only one part of the event. The rest comes from what the strike makes governments feel they must now prove. Israel may now feel pressure to show strength more visibly. The United States may feel pressure to prepare for wider fallout. Regional actors may begin recalculating their exposure, and the deeper that pressure spreads, the harder it becomes to pull the conflict back into a narrower lane. That is why this strike matters more than it first appears. It is not only about what was hit, it is about what the strike now forces every side to think, fear, and prepare for next. The most dangerous point in a conflict is often not the strike itself, but the moment one side decides it must restore deterrence at any cost. That is where this situation may now be heading. If Israeli leaders believe Iran has successfully created the image of vulnerability at the top of the state, then the pressure to respond will become intense, not just to retaliate, but to prove that Israeli leadership, command structure, and national credibility remain intact. And that is where the risk of a much bigger escalation begins. Because once a government feels its authority has been publicly challenged, a limited response can start to look like weakness. A measured response can start to look like hesitation, and in a war already filled with distrust, symbolism, and political pressure, that kind of perception can become almost as dangerous as military damage itself. Israel's next move, therefore, may not be shaped only by what happened on the ground. It may be shaped by what Israeli decision-makers now believe they need to communicate to Iran, to their own public, and to the entire region. They may feel the need to show that any attempt to threaten the country's top leadership will bring consequences so severe that no enemy would dare try it again. That logic is exactly what makes this moment so unstable. Because once retaliation becomes tied to credibility, the scale of response tends to grow. Targets become more symbolic, messaging becomes harsher, the room for restraint becomes narrower, and every actor involved starts preparing for the possibility that the next strike will go further than the last. That includes Washington, because if Israel decides it must answer in a visible and punishing way, the United States may be pulled closer to the edge of this conflict, whether it wants that outcome or not. American officials would then have to think not only about supporting Israel, but also about containing the fallout, protecting regional assets, and preventing the crisis from spreading into a broader war. And once that calculation begins, the entire region starts to feel the pressure. Gulf states begin reassessing risk, proxy groups may become more active, global markets start reacting to the fear that deterrence is being restored through escalation rather than control. That is why Israel's next move matters so much, because if this conflict is now being driven by the need to restore credibility, then the next phase may be defined less by caution and more by the desire to send a message no one can misunderstand. Even though the claim centers on Israel, the shockwaves do not stop at Israel's borders. The moment a conflict between Iran and Israel begins touching the level of top political leadership, the United States and the wider Middle East are pulled into a far more dangerous calculation. Because this is no longer just a question of what one missile may have hit. It is now a question of how far this war could spread if both sides decide they must answer strength with even greater strength. For Washington, that creates an immediate problem. The United States may want to avoid a broader regional war, but it also cannot ignore the possibility that Israel could now feel compelled to respond in a bigger and more visible way. If that happens, Iran may answer again. Iranian-aligned groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or elsewhere could become more active. American bases and personnel in the region could face renewed pressure, and suddenly, what began as one highly charged claim could push several fronts closer to ignition at the same time. That is why moments like this are so dangerous for U.S. planners. They are forced to think several steps ahead while the facts are still incomplete. They have to consider not just what happened, but what each side now believes it must do next. And in conflicts like this, that psychological pressure can move faster than diplomacy. The same is true across the region. Gulf states do not need to be directly hit to feel the consequences. Shipping routes, energy markets, airspace security, and political stability can all come under pressure the moment escalation starts looking less controlled. Regional governments begin asking the same urgent question: is this still a contained confrontation, or is it now moving toward a much wider crisis? That uncertainty alone can shift behavior. It can change military alert levels. It can change diplomatic messaging. It can change the readiness of governments that are not directly part of the strike, but may still be pulled into the fallout. This is why the regional impact of Iran's claim matters so much. Even before full confirmation, it has already widened the sense of danger. It has forced Israel to confront a new level of psychological pressure. It has forced the United States to prepare for the possibility that the next round could spread wider, and it has forced the entire region to consider whether this war is still operating inside limits that both sides can manage. Because once leaders begin making decisions under the shadow of vulnerability at the top, restraint becomes harder to maintain. Every delay is interpreted, every statement is scrutinized, every military move carries the weight of deterrence, pride, and reputation. And when all of that collides at once, escalation can accelerate far faster than diplomacy can slow it down. That is why this moment matters so much. Even if some details remain contested, the effect of the claim is already real. It has forced Israel to confront a new level of psychological pressure. It has forced the United States to prepare for the possibility that the next round could spread wider. And it has forced the entire region to consider whether this war is still operating inside limits that both sides can manage. Because once leaders begin making decisions under the shadow of vulnerability at the top, restraint becomes harder to maintain. Every delay is interpreted, every statement is scrutinized, every military move carries the weight of deterrence, pride, and reputation. And when all of that collides at once, escalation can accelerate far faster than diplomacy can slow it down.
That is what makes this story larger than one claim and larger than one leader. It is a warning sign that the battlefield may now be moving closer to the center of political power itself. If that is true, then the next chapter of this conflict may not be defined simply by what was destroyed, but how far each side is willing to go to prove it still cannot be intimidated. And that is the real danger now. Not just that the war is continuing, but that it may be changing shape in front of the world, becoming more psychological, more symbolic, and far more difficult to contain than before.